Not too bad, says Norman. Are you still, Norman? Are you still trying to grab that data through the clouds? It appears to have been a bit of a challenge.
Caldwell 31 is coming in very nicely at the moment.
Excellent, good stuff. Good stuff. It's been on and off cloudy over Bedford today, and it was cloudy earlier, but it is supposed to clear, looking like that's going to be a cold, sharp frost tonight. But so if you are out there tonight, good luck. Stay warm. It's certainly cold enough, I think. Right, I think everybody is in, so I will go and find the right screen to share. Oh God, you'd think for somebody who works in IT, this would get easier every week, wouldn't you? But no, it doesn't. So I think it is that one. Can you see that one?
Yep.
Excellent. Good. Yes. Thank you. Thanks, Mary. Good job you're here. Everybody else is on mute. I forgot. Right. Good evening all. Good evening all. Episode 39. Gosh, where does that time go? As I say, I hope everybody is well. What do I need to say? So as usual, we'll keep you on mute during the talk. If you've got any questions, please do pop them in the chat. We'll keep an eye on the chat as we go, and then we'll come to an open Q&A session at the end. Good. So tonight then we have the pleasure of being joined by Mary McIntyre. She is a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, amateur astronomer, astronomy communicator. Oh, the screen's in the way. Sorry. Where did I get to? An amateur astronomer, astronomy sketcher, fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society. She has a very busy talk schedule and also writes for the Sky at Night magazine and the Yearbook of Astronomy. She's also co-presenter of the Comet Watch radio show and recently joined the Astro radio team. And I'm sure many of you will remember Pete Williamson, who's given us a couple of talks in the past. So tonight, Mary is going to show us how some of her beautiful artwork is created and tell us about some of her favorites, as well as art that she creates, not just on canvas, but also on clothing as well. And if you haven't had a chance yet to go and visit Mary's website, be sure to do so. Some of the images are absolutely stunning, both traditional astrophotography and her space-inspired art as well. So please do go and pay her a visit. So with that, Mary, I will stop sharing my screen and allow you to share yours.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me come and do this talk. It's one of my favorites. It isn't full of loads of words and facts and dates and stuff like that. This talk originally was designed because I used to do a lot of hands-on sketching workshops at events, which is great. And I've done that in schools and stuff like that. That hasn't been possible this year. So what I've done with this talk is lots and lots of pictures, but I'm also showing kind of mini video tutorials, and I'll explain as we go through how I've created not just the astronomy work, but also the astronomy inspired work. And hopefully that will then give you some kind of idea of where to start if you're thinking about having a go at this. So lots of pictures, and obviously I'll be around to answer any sort of technical questions on art materials and stuff at the end as well. So first of all, what we're going to go through is why did I start sketching? And if any of you have ever tried sketching, you will realize that it makes you look way better at something. But the main reason for me was when I first started astrophotography, which is coming up for 10 years ago, it all became about the photograph for me. And once we built the observatory shed in particular, I would go out, grab the pictures, close the observatory roof, go inside. And when I was processing the picture, I was processing it to make the picture look nice. At no point was I actually properly studying what I'd taken a photograph of. And I think studying photographs is a very legitimate way of observing, and a lot of the sketching that I do is from photographs. But if all you're doing is taking a picture because it looks pretty, then you're not actually learning anything. And I was kidding myself that doing all of this photography was making me a better astronomer and I was learning stuff. I would struggle to name more than 3 lunar craters, but once I I started sketching, that knowledge just kind of went crazy through the roof. And it really does make you a better astronomer in terms of, even if you're not the best at actually creating a creative artwork, just looking at the distances between stars, or the distance, if you're doing a deep sky sketch, looking at the stars versus the placement of some of the aspects of the nebula, it all just makes you look at things in a very, very different way. And honestly, any of the craters that I've sketched now, I can identify instantly under any lighting angle, no matter which way round they're flipped. And I'm one of these people that can't deal with any maps being turned the wrong way round or anything being flipped over. So it's really helped me to kind of get my head together as in terms of being a better astronomer. So in terms of how we're going to approach this, first of all, I'm going to show you my very first sketching attempts, which is kind of bearing my soul because they're not very good, but I'm showing them to you so that hopefully you'll see what my progression was, and it will make you think that you too can do something. I'm going to show you some sketches and how I approach them, first of all from photographs, but also how you can adapt exactly the same techniques to work at an eyepiece if that's what you want to do. And then I'm going to deviate a little bit into some crater asteroid models, and I've actually recently just added a comet model in there as well, show you how I've done that. That was a big learning curve for me because I'm not very good at creating stuff three-dimensionally. I can draw a 3D picture on a page of paper, but making something in 3D was a bit of a challenge. So it's been quite good fun to do that as well. And then I'm going to move on to the stuff that's more astronomy themed. So it might be the nebula or galaxy, everyone calls it, even though it doesn't look like a galaxy, but that type of thing, but also some of the acrylic fluid art that I've been working on this past 12 months, which is great fun. And a little bit of textiles and kind of miscellaneous jewelry making type stuff as well. And so we'll get on with my very first sketches. So it was 2014 when I realized I'd gone probably the best part of a year without ever looking through a telescope eyepiece. And that made me incredibly sad. And obviously that meant I probably wasn't learning very much. And I would always, if it was a clear night, be imaging in the observatory shed. And then when I got my own pier, we've got two piers because my husband and I don't agree on how to do anything when it comes to astrophotography. So we have a pier each now. But I also have a Helios refractor that was given to me years ago by a family member. It's a 102mm refractor. For imaging, it's not the best, but in terms of visual stuff, I still love that telescope. I love the field of view, super lightweight. I've got spine problems, so that works for me. And I actually really love a lot of the kind of the brighter astronomy objects through it. So what I started doing is dragging that Helios refractor out onto the grass when I was imaging and just drawing obviously a very crude representation of Jupiter, but mostly with the focus of seeing what of the cloud belts I could see even through such a small aperture, but mostly the positions of the moons. And I am still clueless about which moon is which unless I've looked at Stellarium or one of the apps that tells you where the moons are, and how the heck people like Galileo figured out these things were it might be obvious they're orbiting, but how do you know which is which? You know, my brain can't do that. So I just started off by doing that. So these were crude and Jupiter wasn't round, but it was interesting to see as the seeing settles down, you just get this glimmer of something here and there that you couldn't see when you first looked at it. Averted vision obviously brings up different things. And so I was kind of hooked even from just doing these on a scrap of paper in my observing book. I then decided that it'd be better if Jupiter was actually circular. So I made these observing sheets and I drew a circle on there. Sometimes the circle's in the middle of the page because the Galileans can be spread evenly. Sometimes it's on one side of the page, sometimes the other. So I've got a selection of those. I haven't used them for ages, but they are there so that wherever the moons are placed, I've got a piece of paper. The downside of doing this is that you'll probably notice the scale is now horribly incorrect because the Galileans are quite far from Jupiter relative to the diameter. So although the positioning of the Galileans is in the right place, their distance from Jupiter in terms of Jupiter diameters isn't the best. But having a bigger circle meant that I was more easily able to capture detail. And that's important with all of the sketching stuff that I'm showing you tonight. Don't be tempted to do it small because it is so much easier if you draw bigger, because it's just a lot easier to fit in detail and stuff like that. So this was a step up, and this is about as much as you're ever going to see in a 102mm refractor, but it was really good fun, and I was really hooked on the planetary stuff. Then we got to 2014 International Sun Day, I think it was, and I was trying my best to get a decent image out of the Coronado PST solar scope that we've got. And the Coronado PST at that time, the only camera that I had to fit onto it was a digital SLR, and that telescope is notoriously difficult to image with a digital SLR and get a good picture out of it. The conditions that day were very, very hazy, and I was really struggling to get anything even worth getting off the memory card. It was just terrible. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to draw this. And the advantage of drawing the sun in H alpha is that you can tune the etalon and add the features as they pop out, which is something you can't do very easily with a photograph. I tend to kind of go somewhere in the middle, so I get a bit of everything, which isn't ideal, because sometimes the problems are brighter at one end, the plages look brighter somewhere else, and the surface kind of detail looks better at a slightly different wavelength again. So by sort of marking out these, I'm pointing with my hands, I still can't get used to the fact you can't see my hands, but kind of over here, just marking out the plages first, the filaments next, and then just working around the edge, just marking roughly where the prominences were. The surface features, I basically put the pencil on the side and just do random squiggles. I'm not capturing every single swirl of chromosphere here. It's just, you know, just a kind of gives the illusion of what you've seen, and that's absolutely fine, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we do lunar stuff in a second. But I was really hooked on this, and I was finding that I was actually capturing more detail through this telescope with my pencils than I actually was doing just doing it with a photograph. Now, with white light sun images, this is great because you can color the middle of the sunspot in. The rest of the sun is white, particularly if you're using a Barda solar filter. And then you've got the kind of gray bit around the middle. So you've got the umbra and the penumbra. So that is super easy to capture in HB pencil. And I was really enjoying practicing that, but I was finding that I wasn't kind of in love with what I was doing with pencil. I liked it, and I liked the detail I was able to get, and I was getting better each sketch, but I was much preferring the white light sketches in pencil. And then it was, oh, and this is done from a photograph, which was stacked. So this is an important point to make here as well, before I forget to say it in future bits. When you are sketching from a photograph, you are going to be seeing a lot more detail than when you sketch at an eyepiece. So when you practice, if you're practicing from photographs and you're thinking, oh God, I'm never going to be able to do this at an eyepiece, you absolutely will, because you are not going to see lines around the penumbra if you're looking at this visually. And the same with the moon, you're not going to see huge levels of detail on the surface of the moon when you're doing it visually. So once you've learned how to kind of capture complex stuff, it's actually easier to do it at the eyepiece because it's simpler. But still loving sketching in white light. But it was a chance email exchange with somebody about an entirely different subject, but they mentioned that they too did solar sketching, and they did it on black paper with colored pastels. And I'm like, you idiot, you have black paper and colored pastels, because pastels are one of my favorite mediums to work with, just in general sketching terms, when I used to do more art. So this was my first attempt. Photographing this is hard, because if you've got any sunlight coming in, you end up with a weird light gradient. But being able to just capture the color really brought these to life for me. And then I was completely hooked on pastel sketching. And these are the sorts of things you can do. Now, again, I've kind of marked out any lighter areas, prominences, and it's all about working with light and shade, and you can make anything look three-dimensional by some simple placement of light and shade. And I'm going to show you step-by-step sketches in a second when I do the lunar stuff. And you can do exactly the same thing with prominences to give this depth and this kind of real movement, because this is a dynamic part of the sun. This is moving. Even in half an hour period, you can see evolution of prominences. So it really adds the movement and makes it feel more dynamic doing it with the different colors like this. The rest of it is just, again, the pencil on its side and just doing random rough scribbles until all of it's covered, making sure you leave some of the dark through there to just again add a little bit of depth. By the way, some of these pictures say Spicer on them. I was Spicer before I got married 4.5 years ago, so I haven't stolen anybody's sketches. I was artist formerly known as Mary Spicer. So yeah, I was really loving the pastel sketching. And this was a sketch that I did. I was fortunate enough to be in the USA in 2017 for the solar eclipse. And when I got home, I had to draw what I photographed. So this is a fairly high dynamic range photograph that I spent hours working on, and then I sketched from that because there wasn't enough time. We had 8 cameras at the time and totality lasts 2.5 minutes, and I wanted a minute to just look and not actually spend ages trying to capture anything else. And I love this sketch because when I put it out online, somebody actually emailed me and said, have you seen the sketch by Mary Proctor from the 1896 eclipse from Norway? And I'd never heard of Mary Proctor. And I do a talk on the history of women in astronomy, and I'd never heard of Mary Proctor. So I was so delighted somebody sent me this sketch because there are some real similarities between the two of them, and that made me extremely happy. And I hope that the ancient astronomers would be happy that people are still sketching today. So I'm going to talk you through step by step how I do lunar stuff with pastels. And the stuff that I use, the first black pad I ever bought off Amazon was the Frisk brand. The reason I really like that paper, it was a complete fluke. I just bought it because it was black and it was cheap, but it means that it's got a really smooth surface, and a lot of pastel papers have got texture. And when you're trying to kind of fill in fine details, the texture can be a bit of a nuisance, and it also makes blending a little bit more difficult. It kind of grips the pastel and gives a lovely texture. So I do like pastel paper, but just not for astronomy purposes. This is great because it's got a really shiny, or not quite shiny, but it's a very smooth surface. So not only can you blend very easily, but also if you make a mistake, just get some cotton wool and rub over it and blend it away, and then you can come back afterwards and just draw on top of it if you need to, which is great. The pencils that I use are Stabilo Carbothello, and I just bought this set again, and I actually really love the way that they blend. You can buy them individually, and I found that out of this set, my black and white were like sharpened down to a stump at that point, and the rest were all still really big. So I now buy them in black, white, and lamp black. The lamp black was an accident. I didn't mean to buy lamp black, but I'm really glad I did because it's very useful for certain things, which I'll point out in a second. If you're going to use pastel pencils, the advantage is that when you sharpen them, you can get a fine point, and as long as you don't press on too hard, you can then go in and do some pretty fine work with them. But to sharpen them, you need to get one of these old-fashioned rotating handled pencil sharpeners, because the angle of a kind of graphite pencil sharpener will just crumble them. But when I do sketching workshops in person, we also always have stick pastels on the table, and people do just as good a job with them because they're square. So there's always a corner that you can use that will give you fine detail. So if any of you have pastels at home and you're thinking of having a go at this, just use what you have. Don't feel you've got to go out and buy anything special. Just whatever pastels you've got, whatever pencils you've got, just printer paper if that's all you've got, have a go, and I think you'll be surprised at what you can do. So in the very simplest terms, this is about creating light and shade. So on my black paper, the first thing I do is lay down, just cross hatching very finely with white and blend it. Then this is just showing you that even with one black dot, a white dot and a gray dot, you've got something that looks three-dimensional. And these little kind of craterlets are about as much detail as you can get for a lot of the craters on the moon, especially when you're doing it naked eye. But what's great is that whenever you've got a crater that's a little bit bigger, this isn't a crater, it is just me making some stuff up, by the way. It's not, don't try and identify what this is. But basically for everything that you draw in the center, just always have in mind the angle of the shadows and think where the sun's coming from. But every tiny little dot that you do around the outside all sells the idea that you've got the sun coming from the same direction, and it makes the entire page just look super three-dimensional. And all I'm doing again on this bigger one is a bit of kind of very blended white, very white bit, very black bit and then a kind of grey bit that's a bit more muted. And it's all really just the morphology of the crater will dictate where the white bits are and where the dark bits are. But you can just work your way out from there. So any of these little steps on their own will still look fairly 3D, but the minute you start adding craterlets or even just a tiny boulder with a triangle, that is all that is. It's a blob with a triangle and a bit of grey around it. But if you just forget that and just glance at that picture, it looks like a detailed 3D drawing. And everything that I do is broken down into these steps. It's just trying to see the overall picture with a really abstract eye. So look for the blacker areas, look for the very white areas. Once you've got those laid down, everything else is shades of grey in between. And it's the same process no matter what I'm drawing. That's basically the kind of steps that I follow. So this is, all of you guys, I'm sure, know Dave Eagle. This was a photograph of the Plato region that Dave put online, which I really loved the crater shadows on. And this is obviously super sped up, but you can see that all I'm doing here is putting white, black and grey, and it's all about breaking it down into shapes. And if you want to go around the outside and add more stuff and do a bigger area, that's fine. But if all you want to do is just the crater, just having like this bit here, 2 of those, just selling the idea that the shadows are going the same way, and that's it. And it's really not that difficult to do if you break it down in that way. And I actually was doing a sketching workshop recently, and I was drawing the same crater for the 5th time that week with a group of children, and I suddenly realized that this one particular shadow looked like Snoopy led on his back. And you can kind of start seeing totally different things in all of the sketches. And somebody was looking at one of my acrylic fluid art pictures, and they could see 8 different faces in it, which I'd never even noticed. So it's about breaking it down into manageable chunks and shapes that you can work with. And yeah, some of these shadows aren't quite the right angle, to be honest, but overall you kind of get the idea, and it does look super 3-dimensional. But none of these bits, if you look at any one bit in particular, there's no fine detail here. It's fairly crude detail that overall starts to sell a picture. So these are some of the other sketches that I've done. This is Arzacle, and this one is Aristarchus and Herodotus region, but it's just one of those 2. I can't remember which it is now. I think it's Herodotus. But when you want to draw a crater like this, you need to kind of find a phase of the moon where you've got really good crater shadows, because that's when you get the brighter white regions and you get that good kind of shadow definition. So that usually means it's when the terminator is nearby. And it's really good fun. And when you've kind of practiced on a simple crater, you do something like Arzacle, you've got a crater, you've got some slump terraces. Look at this slump terrace here. It looks at a glance like I've done all this work on getting every little kind of slump correct on this crater. I haven't. I've got the really obvious dark shadowy bits, the bright bits. All of the rest here is me just doing some wiggly lines to imply that there are slump terraces there. From a scientific purpose, this isn't as accurate, but in terms of just practicing the technique and getting something that looks like a crater, it doesn't matter that every tiny speck is where it should be. It really doesn't matter. And I'm going to show you some collages of other people's sketches of the same object in a second to just show that. But this is great because you've got a central peak to work with. You've got little craterlets. You've got really tiny little craterlets that are just on the edge of resolution for that setup, and it's really, really pretty. And then don't forget as well that the crater itself is usually casting a shadow as well, so if you can extend out that way, it all just kind of makes it all more believable. The other thing that's really good is to do crater trios, and this is one of my favorite sketches that I've ever done, and it was actually a photograph taken with the Liverpool telescope during a last quarter moon. The Ptolemaeus trio is one of my favorite crater trios. I just love it so much, and this picture ended up winning a competition, and my prize was to get that printed on a big canvas. So now, having already got a house full of other artworks, I now want to paint moon stuff on a big canvas because it looks epic. But this was done on a piece of A4 which I photographed with my phone, I think, and then it's been printed on a canvas that's really big, and it looks like I've actually painted it on the canvas. So again, if you look at this, there isn't actually a huge amount of detail. There's a little bit of shading here that's very muted. What I do for that, because obviously a pastel pencil gives you a quite harsh line, I always have a scrap piece of paper next to me and I will scribble a load of white and a load of black on it. Then I rub a cotton bud all over the pastel, whichever color I want, and then use the cotton bud to add these little features. And this is really useful for adding when you're doing a fairly large area of the moon's surface. There are always bits that are a bit darker, a bit lighter, but not an actual kind of difference in height as such. There isn't like a ridge there, and that's great for doing that. And you can just outline an area and just allude to the fact that texture's there. Same with this one. There's stuff around the outside, but again, the kind of those sort of fracture lines on the outside of the ejector here on this little craterlet, it's just wiggly lines, honestly. And this over here is just dots, just me doing some textured dots, and just experiment with different things that kind of replicate the textures that you're seeing in the picture. And it is really therapeutic. It's very, very good fun. And when at the end of it, you get something that looks like the photograph you were working from, you'll be really proud of it. One tip as well is that when you're doing this, you are going to probably hate your sketch about halfway through and think this rubbish, it looks nothing like it. I've never yet done a sketch that I haven't hated until I'm 90% of the way through. Then I usually go off in a strop and make a cup of tea. And when I come back and look at it upside down from the other side of the table, it makes you kind of sit up and think, did I draw that? Because it looks really different when you see it from an angle not where you've just been sat drawing it. So my tip to you is to take a photograph of it with your phone, look at it on the back of your phone 5 minutes later, and you will be amazed at how different it looks. And that is what other people are seeing when they look at your sketches. So you're going to be your worst critic. I am terrible at criticizing my own work, photographic or sketches. But once you take a picture and just kind of look at it again later on, you might be surprised. The other thing that's really good fun to do is, like, obviously near the lunar terminator, the landscape is changing over a fairly short time period. So this is the lunar X, and it's the same lunar X region about an hour apart, and it just shows how the X is no longer, it's barely discernible anymore once you kind of get the sunlight onto it. But you're starting to see other things coming into light here, the kind of tall regions of the bit on the shadow side. Suddenly you're now seeing the central peaks of this crater. So it's all really interesting to kind of capture that evolution. And the same with crater sunrises. This is the Ptolemaios trio. These were photographs taken with a mobile phone by Dave Galvin, and I just sketched them. And I've actually done some crater shadow calculations to calculate the height of the crater wall on Ptolemaios using these sketches. And it wasn't perfect, but given that it was a sketch from a mobile phone picture, it was within the right ballpark. So what was interesting is they were both inaccurate relative to the published height of the crater wall, but the two sketches themselves came out very close together when I did the calculation. So I was astonished, to be honest, because you can see they're not even the same sphericalness. But you can see the important thing is the evolution of the shadows, and that's what's been captured here. And you can also see that this crater floor is falling away downhill towards the other crater wall. So you're picking up so much stuff that I had never, ever noticed that Ptolemaios doesn't have a flat floor. Oh, it's not going to, it's like 170 kilometers across or something, isn't it? It's huge, but it's basically the length of the M62 across this crater. So I'd be astonished if it was exactly level. If you want to kind of move on to bigger areas of the moon, it's all the same techniques. This was the first one that I actually ever did in pastels. And at a glance, somebody accused me basically of taking a photograph and putting a Photoshop filter on it, which I was really annoyed at because I'd spent 4 hours on this sketch. But if you look at this, these craters have hardly any actual detail on them. There's no scope for it. When you're looking at a bigger piece of the moon, this is Archimedes, the picture I showed you of Archimedes before. I didn't know Archimedes existed when I did this sketch, but instantly you can tell it's Archimedes because of the shape here, and you just get to know the overall shapes of these craters. Every one of these components is actually very simple in its own right. I just took the time to do it piece by piece by piece. The thing that I did very wrong when I did this sketch was to try and get a bit of detail around the mountains. I was really struggling. I zoomed in. I always have my photograph on my laptop. I zoomed in on it and then I forgot to zoom out again. So half the sketch is at one zoom on my laptop screen, the other half is at a different one. So if you overlay this on top of the photograph I worked from, they're nothing like each other, but at a glance looks like a really nice piece of art. And for a first ever go at moon sketching, I was quite pleased. And similarly, this is crater Endymion. This was a photograph by Pete Lawrence, and again, not actually a huge amount of detail here, but the essential bright bits are there and the essential shadow bits are there. That is all you need. As long as the shadows and the light is in the right place, you've got the general consensus of that crater. And then you can just work out and do bigger and bigger areas. And I follow all the same steps if I'm doing a whole disc sketch. And what I do is I've normally got several of these templates with a center cut out. And that just means that when you blend the edge, you have a nice, neat kind of sphere, because turns out I really can't draw a circle. Certainly can't blend within a circle very accurately. So having that template is a really big help. And again, first of all, the shadowy bits, then the bright bits, and then just go along. Now you can see that there's crater trio here. There's literally 3 lines on each of those. That's all there is. But overall, when you see the whole picture, it all just kind of comes together. One thing this is really good for, these whole disk moon images, is as gifts. And I've done this as a 50th birthday present, anniversary present, a wedding present, a birth of a child. The moon as it looked on a particular date that is important to you or the person. Find a picture of the moon or use Stellarium to get the moon phase. Try and get a rough idea of what the libration's like, because that will change where the position of everything is. Then do a sketch of it like this, and then you can give that as an original one-of-a-kind piece of artwork, and nobody else will have one. And they're really special gifts to give, incredibly fun to do, and very, very personal. And yeah, there is not that much detail on these sketches when you actually break them down. And this was my moon phase diagram all done in sketches. It took me so long to do this because every time I did a whole moon image, it seemed to be a similar kind of thing. So like every important date seemed to be a waxing crescent for me for years. So it took me a while to actually do sketches that covered the whole moon phase, but hopefully I'll add to this and fill in the gaps in between. Now, I mentioned lamp black earlier on, and lamp black has got a kind of navy blue undertone to it. It's a really nice color, but it isn't black. And when I'm doing crater shadows, I want black. I don't want blue. But one thing that's really useful for is if you are doing earthshine. Now, for exactly the reason I just said, if you wanted to do something that was special for somebody on a date and you find out it's a 1.5% waxing crescent moon, then your slight semicircle single line moon is not going to be that impressive. But what I do instead, anytime that the crescent is smaller than probably a quarter of the surface illuminated, I will basically use a picture of a full moon to fill in the vague features, but very muted, as if it was a full moon sketch. But I use lamp black instead of black, and that gives it that bluish tone that earthshine quite often has when you look at it through binoculars, certainly always has on photographs. And I love blue, so I'm all over this, and I really love using lamp black for this purpose. But if you don't have it, you can still do this with ordinary black. I've done that as well, but I really love the blue tone that the lamp black gives you. So I mentioned that I've done sketching workshops. Solar Sphere is one of the festivals that I do them at, and this was the 2019 sketches. We worked from photographs, so there was Arzacle, Archimedes. I think somebody did Dave's picture over here of Plato, and this was people age ranging from 3 years old to 80 years old. Everybody that sat at the table said, I can't draw. And just following those simple steps, that this is what they got. The reason I like showing these is because what this shows is that essentially like this is clearly the same crater as this, but those photos, the sketches rather, look nothing like each other's. And that's absolutely fine. We, in the same way that we all have individual styles of handwriting, we all have the same style of drawing as well, different from each other's. And I think it's really important that when you start learning to draw, certainly for artistic purposes, that you don't try and project your own drawing style on somebody else. It's fine that your sketch won't look like mine, because half the time if I did it twice, mine wouldn't look like mine either. So all of these look like the photographs we were working from, no two the same. That's absolutely perfect. That's exactly what we want. So don't worry if you think yours looks different, because everybody's does. Now, until recently, I hadn't done any kind of serious lunar crater sketches with pencil, and the idea daunted me horrendously. But I actually did some online sketching workshops just recently, which meant we had to use pencils because most people don't have kind of fancy art supplies at home. So it had to be stuff that people could do on printer paper with just ordinary pencils. So it took me a few goes of sitting down and just kind of having a play around with the order in which to do it. And it actually wasn't that different from the way that I do it with pastels, except that with paper, your white bits are the white page. So once you've coloured over it, yes, you can rub it out, but if you've used a dark lead pencil, it can be quite hard to clean it off completely, particularly if you're using like 4B or a 2B pencil, which are really good, but they smudge very easily and it's almost impossible to remove them. So having a rubber with sharp edges is useful, but when you're doing a crater sketch on paper like this, I like to just roughly mark out the shape, and then I'll do the shadows, and then I'll draw around all the white bits so that when I do the next steps, I'm not accidentally colouring them in. Then after that, again, it's shades of grey and then just adding those finishing touches. So the shadows aren't as dark when you do it in pencil, but I do those dark bits first, mark out the white bits, and then it's just a very gentle shading action to just cover the fact that the floor of the crater is a darker color of gray than the highlighted crater rim is. Just bring the finished sketch up. Actually, I didn't leave quite enough white on this sketch in the end, but I really like the texture that you get with graphite pencil sketching. I actually really like it now. I didn't when I first started doing it because it was so different. Again, it's all just shapes, black shapes, and then shades of gray. What I like to do if I've just done a crater in isolation is to go around the outside with this kind of cross hatching, or even if you just scribble in one direction, because it makes it look like you deliberately finished it there rather than you forgot to finish the sketch, if that makes sense. If you're intending to come back at a later date possibly and add more, then by all means leave it. But I think just having a little bit of pencil around the outside just kind of makes it look a bit finished. So I haven't done loads of pencil sketches yet, but I've got these great photographs that I use in workshops, which I have done loads of pastel sketches of. So this is Archimedes again, and this is Herodotus and Aristarchus, and they were actually really good fun to do in pencil. Now I've kind of got my head around it a little bit. If you're going to do the whole moon in pencil, again, exactly the same thing applies, but one thing that's really useful is to use your rubber to get these ejector rays that are a bit lighter in color. So if you blend it all in first, I've obviously marked out the really bright ejector rays around Copernicus and Kepler and stuff like that, and that's fine. But once you've kind of blended the darker regions for the Maria, you can just get the corner of your rubber and just sweep up to take away that material. And don't worry that you're not getting every single detail there, because this is enough. Now, I did this sketch and I thought there's something about it I don't like. And it was basically the fact that the background is white when where you're looking at the moon, it's got a black background. So I wasn't sure if I was going to like it, so I took photographs of it in case I ruined the sketch. But I just went over with a really dark lead pencil and just kind of sketched it in and blended it. What I ended up with then was a sketch that looks like it's been partly done with charcoal, which I actually really like because I love charcoal sketching. You don't have to do that, but it just kind of finishes it off for me, because a full moon always has a darker sky behind it rather than white. It can kind of look a little bit insipid if it's on a white background, but that's entirely personal choice. So yeah, exactly the same principles there. Now, I did one of the sketching workshop I did was in the village. I actually did it so that I could practice the camera angles with my separate camera and all that stuff. We did Crater Archimedes. We did it in 20 minutes because that's all the time I had. And this was the result from a bunch of children that have never done lunar sketching before. And it's just really interesting seeing the different drawing styles that people have. And I really like this one because it just shows you that even rough scribbles and pencil lines still look fine. And if you look at Galileo's sketches, you can see pencil lines, and that's totally okay. It's a pencil drawing. You don't have to blend it away till there's no sign of any pencil strokes. And I think sometimes this just shows that it is actually a sketch rather than a photograph that looks like a sketch, if that makes sense. So really interesting. So moving on to some deep sky stuff now. And this was one of the first times I actually had a go at sketching the Pleiades, and it's my favorite astronomy object. I just adore it. This was out of my sketching book, so it's now been my observing book, sorry, so it's now got a fold down the middle of it. It's not that exciting, but the fact it was on white paper and the stars were black as I drew them was messing with my head, because I don't have a brain that can think in inverse at all. But that said, it's actually easier to draw in pencil because it's easier to be precise and to blend the fine detail of a deep sky sketch sometimes if you're doing an eyepiece sketch. One thing that's really useful to do is, if you are going to practice deep sky sketching, is to use stellarium to find the object you want to draw and then put the ocular view on, because that will give you a circular field of view. Because one of the things I really struggled with when I did that Pleiades picture was thinking about how I'm going to translate this circular field of view onto a square page. And I ended up getting some of the things in the wrong place because of it. So now, like I did with Jupiter, I have sheets with a circle drawn on it for this purpose. This was actually done on black paper with white pastels, but equally you can do it on white paper and then invert it. Faststone Image View is free of charge, and all the kind of editing that I've done to my sketches that I'm going to show you tonight was done in Faststone. Super easy, kind of one slider type stuff. So this is the Leaping Minnow and Splash in Auriga. I've still not seen it visually, but I really want to because it's beautiful. The thing to look for when you're doing a sketch like this at the eyepiece is, first of all, find the brighter stars and think of this as a clock face. So see if there's anything roughly in the center, and then the way that you would star hop if you're doing visual stuff, you can star hop your way out and put some stuff around the outside as well to give you a flavor of where you're going to from here to there. Because if you've just got an empty page, it can be a bit, you get the scale wrong basically. So think about the relative distances between the stars of each of the groups. I think the first thing I did was the actual leaping minnow, because it's like a miniature version of Delphinus and it's really cute. But that little parallelogram is a really useful kind of marker group to get in there. But basically it's clock face, brighter stars first, and then just go through and add the star chains. And it's hard. The first time you do this at an eyepiece, it's really hard. But once you've done it 2 or 3 times, it becomes a lot easier. The way that I light my page, by the way, if I'm doing an eyepiece sketch, is I've got a clip-on LED reading light, and I have got some empty Quality Street strawberry cream wrappers that, because the red film that you can buy for putting over screens is too thick to wrap around a reading light. So I took one for the team and ate about 10 strawberry creams and then just wrapped that around some of the orange creams as well, because orange tones it down, and you know it'd be unscientific not to test the efficacy of the orange chocolate wrapper as well. So I actually put all of those around my reading light, and it can slide on and off, so I can use it without that on. And when you pull that over and I clip it so it's pointing away from me, so my page is illuminated in kind of a reddish orange toned, and then I always use the same eye to look in the eyepiece and the other eye to kind of, so I close that eye when I'm sketching so I don't ruin my night vision. So that way I get a muted illumination on my page. I usually use a clipboard and just have it on my lap. And a comfortable chair is so important when you're doing this. Now, I did this sketch of Comet Neowise over the summer. It was such a treat to have Comet Neowise, and it fitted perfectly into my 15 by 20 binoculars. So I sketched it and then I inverted it in fast stone. In hindsight, I really wish I'd done this in pastels, because the tail was beautiful, but it was very kind of blended looking tail. It didn't have tons of structure at that magnification. So it was actually, it didn't have structure when I imaged it at higher mag either. So I think pastels would have been better for getting a smoother blend, but just one click to invert the image and just get the illumination looking something like what you were seeing. So it's actually, if you don't have the black paper and the pastels, you can still do this and just invert it. Same with the Orion Nebula. This was one I did before I started using the circular field of view, but this was one that I just did the first sketch I ever did through those big binoculars, and the Orion Nebula looks stunning through those binoculars. It's the most detail I've ever seen on a nebula visually. It's just gorgeous. Then you invert it and you get something like that. So it's the same principles again that I mentioned with the leaping minnow. Just mark out the brighter stars first. Then you can kind of add in the faint bits of nebulae. Was it oh, his name's gone out of my head. Somebody did a talk for Basingstoke Astro recently. His name will come back to me. One of the tips that he has is to, if you've got pastels and you're doing a sketch at the eyepiece like this, and you've got, say it's like a star cluster that has a hint of kind of nebulosity behind it, you just use a blade and scrape a bit of pastel dust off, and then use a brush to dab it on, and then just kind of dab it with your finger, and that just gives a hint of nebulosity without an actual pencil stroke that might be too harsh. I haven't tried that yet, but it looks like a really great technique. And I guess you could do exactly the same with pencil. You could just scrape a little bit of the lead off and do that. Now, as much as I love eyepiece sketches, and ultimately it's all just small grey fuzzy blobs, and I love these objects. They're amazing. The fact the light's traveled so far to hit my eyeball is amazing to me. But from an art point of view, this sort of sketch isn't quite as striking as a sketch that you do from a photograph. So using the same field of view, this is the Orion Nebula done from one of my long exposure photographs, which was an accumulation of data over 3 years. You can see that you're getting a much more kind of striking sketch, if you will. So I think it's really good to do both. I think it's very important to do the kind of eyepiece sketch stuff, but I also just love creating actual artwork. And I do that from photographs, because you're never going to see this at the eyepiece. It's just not going to happen. And this was done with oil pastels, which I will never work with again for astronomy purposes because they're hideous. But I just basically did this planetary nebula that I think is so faint that you actually wouldn't even be able to see it through a telescope, or if you did, it would be nothing like this. So this was a Hubble palette picture of NGC 6751, really pretty. I loved the spherical structure of it. And it was the same process that I've done with all the other things, just the really white bits, then just mark out the boundaries where the darker and the light bits are, then just kind of go in with the color and blend it. But oil pastels don't blend awfully easily. So in future, I'll definitely try this again, but with the chalk pastels. This was a Horsehead Nebula sketch, and it was based off a photograph taken with the Fawkes 2-meter telescope. I was at one of Pete Williamson's workshops a few years ago, and he gave me some of the raw data to play with. I did this pastel sketch in monochrome, so the sketch was just done with white pastels with a little bit of black here and there. And I actually did this sketch at the International Astronomy Show while I was on my stand a couple of years ago. But with one slider in Fast Stone Image Viewer, I was able to colorize it. And if you go into the color module and go into the hue slider, moving that from left to right will totally change the color of your image, but without touching the black background. And this is something that I've used a lot that I'm going to show you with what's coming next. So you can do a lot. And I think if you are doing a sketch like this from a photograph, it is already a piece of art. So don't be afraid of playing around with it digitally. It's just artwork. It doesn't matter. And all I've done is made it the color that it is if you take a picture of it with a color camera. So it's fine to do that. You would spend hours image processing if you've imaged it. So you can do the same with sketching if you want to. Now at Solar Sphere, again, we did some deep sky sketching one day. These were the Horsehead Nebula pictures that people produced. All of these look like the Horsehead Nebula, but no two look the same. My particular favorite was the one where the child actually drew an actual horse. I think it was this one. They they saw the horse's head and drew an entire horse in that black gap, which is, no, it's this one, sorry. Yeah, that's there. That's the one that's a whole horse, which I just think is adorable. I absolutely love that. But all these others could be photographs. They genuinely look like they could be photographs of the object. All people that have said they couldn't draw, just following those same principles. Another Forks telescope image was one of the Whirlpool galaxy, just so beautiful. And when I did this sketch, I hated it so much that I nearly put it straight in the recycling. The following morning, I got up and looked at it again. I thought, it's not that bad. And then it grew on me loads over time. And it was actually really hard to get my head around how to approach this, but it was just following the same principles with something like this that has so much nebulosity. You can kind of just blend the whole area first and get the rough shape blended and then just go in and add detail. It really took me a while to get my head around how to do it, but it was all really just following the same steps. And we also did the Fireworks Galaxy as part of that sketching workshop. So these pieces of art, this is where you're starting to see a lot of real creativity creeping in. No two were even remotely like each other here, and some of them are more true to the photograph we were working from. Others are just utterly beautiful, inspired by that painting, and that's amazing. I really love spiral galaxies, but they can be quite tricky to draw. Now I'm going to talk about creating some models, and the first thing that I'm going to talk about is how I created a model of Archimedes. One of the things that I love is crater shadows. I love drawing them, but what I love is what those shadows are actually telling us about what we're looking at. And one of the great things that you can learn is just seeing how things change over time during an entire crater sunrise and crater sunset. Unfortunately, a crater sunrise takes place over several hours, although it does change fairly quickly. It will be several hours before the sun has fully risen over a crater. Then, depending where the crater is on the lunar surface, it could be 2 weeks before you then get the sunset. So I created a model. This was made without any idea of doing this to scale in terms of crater wall height versus diameter. I had none of that information to hand when I did this. What was important was creating something that had a crater wall that was the shape that would roughly give me the shadow shapes that I was seeing from this one photograph. In hindsight, I should have looked at this under lots of different lighting angles first, but it just gives you an idea of what can be done. And the way that I did this was using liquid latex first. I just used an old sandwich box, poured a layer of latex in first and let it cure overnight in the airing cupboard. Then I used a liquid latex paste. So what you do there is just take any baking flour, pour some latex in a bowl and just add a little bit of flour at a time and keep mixing it. And it will form this kind of gloopy thing that you can actually sculpt with. Now you do it in small batches because it cures very, very quickly when it's got the flour in it, because it sucks all the moisture out. But you can do it in layers because latex will stick to latex. So it's better to do it in small batches. And this is where my love of Halloween and creating horrific SFX things has really helped me out, because it was a really fun process. So I started off there. I just marked out where the crater was going to be roughly. All I used for sculpting was a spoon and a pencil. And once you've dumped the latex down, if you dip your finger or your tools into some clean liquid latex, you can smooth it around the outside, and your fingers then won't stick to it because they're covered in wet latex. And just slowly build that up. And periodically I just got my phone out, put the torch on and pointed it to see, because all I had was one photograph, so I had to kind of look at the crater shadow being cast onto the ground beyond to try and get the shapes of the basic areas. Now obviously in terms of height, diameter, the scale is horribly wrong, but at the end of it all I ended up with something that, once it had cured, kind of did the job. The beauty of this is that the first times I tried this, I did it using Mod Rock and plaster of Paris. Very, very heavy, also very brittle. So for outreach purposes, I can take this anywhere. The lid just fits on the sandwich box. I can then take the lid off. If this gets dropped, it's rubber. Nothing's going to happen to it. It's not very heavy. It's friendly for children to play with. They're not going to hurt themselves on it. I sprayed it white, even though there's no need because you're going to shine a bright torch on, but just for the sake of finishing it nicely. And then I used the sunlight to actually create a video that is mimicking an entire crater sunrise and sunset. So here the sun is getting higher on this side of the sky, and that means the shadows are getting shorter. Then when it's fully illuminated from above, there'll be no shadows. And then once we get to crater sunset, the sun's now dipping on the left side here, and those shadows then start to elongate, and then you get a crater sunset. So that is a really cool way of being able to demonstrate an entire crater sunrise and sunset with no information about scale and size and relative heights. All that is just alluding to those shadows, and it's a really great way of demonstrating that for outreach purposes. The other thing that I did, that was a Sky at Night article commission. This one was as well, to make a model of an asteroid, and it had to be from household materials because for children to actually build a model, liquid latex doesn't smell very nice and may not be that widely available everywhere. So I had to come up with a way of making an asteroid from something household. So I used salt dough, and this was my model of Eros. You learn so much about an object when it's bad enough sketching it. When you make a 3D model of something, boy, do you have to study it. And with somebody that doesn't have a very good three-dimensional brain, the way that I did this is there is an animation on YouTube, on NASA's YouTube channel, from the Near Shoemaker space probe, and they've done a 3D animation of the asteroid rotating in different views. And I screenshotted it every few frames and just had the panel of all of those shots up on my laptop screen when I was making it. So dead simple, just flour, water and salt. And I think it's kind of equal parts salt to flour to water. So it's just a 3-part dough. All you do is mix it together. You just need it not to develop gluten or anything. You just want a kind of smooth dough. And then because this stuff takes so long to bake in the oven at a low temperature, and the weight of it because of the moisture content means that it kind of squashes itself. I split the asteroid in half lengthways and did it in 2 halves and baked them for 25 hours in the end it took to actually fully cure. And even then the middle was a bit squidgy, and then I kind of stuck them together using a bit of flour and water and PVA glue when necessary. So it was a challenge because suddenly you've folded it out like this, but it worked really, really well. And basically all I used was a pencil and a Sharpie to do some bigger divots. And again, this is just about creating something that is going to give you shadows that look like the original. The other thing I did is just get some little tiny pieces of salt dough and rub them together in my hands, and that created all of these flakes that dried really quickly. You may have noticed that photograph from the Shoemaker probe. Basically, this asteroid used to have craters, but seismic activity has shook them all down to rubble. So there's actually loads of kind of loose gravel and rubble on the surface of the asteroid. So I wanted to capture that and stick that on as well. So just basically glued it together, glued on all of those bits, gave it a coat of grey paint because asteroids have got a very low albedo, which is why we don't find them until they're really close to Earth. And then looking like this doesn't look that great, but if you then recreate the lighting angles that you got from the actual mission, then it suddenly looks like the asteroid. And I remade this twice because I was thinking it's rubbish, but once you kind of get the light shining on it in the right way, it really did look like the original photographs that I worked from. So all the pictures on the left are the space probe ones, and the right hand pictures are my model. And when you look at it at a glance like this, it, it kind of looks quite cool. So that was really good fun. Another thing that I like to take for outreach purposes is this model of the plough, and I was inspired to make this when I visited the Science Museum in Denver. When you walked into a room there, they had these huge illuminated orbs that made up the plough, but they only looked like the plough when you stood in one particular spot. They were placed at kind of different distances that were actually to scale based on how distant they are from Earth. So I scaled this up and did it with balls on sticks. Nearly every astronomy model I make ends up being polystyrene balls on sticks, but it kind of works. So if you stand about meter and a half in front of this box, if it's on a table, then the stars of the plough are to scale in terms of light years to the distance away that they would be in real terms. So if you then turn the model to the side, you can see some of them are kind of hanging out in a similar area, but we're talking 100 light years across this box, this scale here. So there are some big differences between these two. They are a long way from each other. And this is a good model to kind of represent it, because you can put it on a turntable and just show that constellations and asterisms have absolutely nothing to do with each other at all in real terms in space. So that's a really fun thing to make as well. This was a Comet model that was in a recent Sky at Night episode as well, a Sky at Night magazine issue rather. And this was basically an A4 piece of craft foam, just a thin foam sheet. So you could do it with cardboard, fold it round into a cone and stuck cotton wool on it. And it really looks like a comet. It was kind of loosely based on lots of different comets. It's not a model of a specific comet, but you could adapt this technique to be a very specific comet. And then the ion tail is just a blue pipe cleaner. I didn't have any blue pipe cleaners. Turns out blue felt tip pens are not watertight, so I ended up looking like a Smurf for a week after making this, but I think it actually works really well. This is the polystyrene ball on sticks bit, but I also glued a bit of cotton wool around it to kind of represent the nucleus. And while, at a glance, these models look a bit like an executive toy, in terms of doing a project with children, every component of all of these models is representing something about that object. So it's a really good learning opportunity. So the nucleus was the polystyrene ball, but the cotton wool around that was basically the coma. Painting it green was obviously the volatiles that looked green, the blue pipe cleaner being the ion tail. So there's loads of opportunity there for kind of educating while building it. Then at the end of it, you've got something that looks quite cool. So bamboo skewers and polystyrene balls for the win. So moving on to the astronomy inspired artwork. First of all, this was kind of trying to look like the Crab Nebula. It was the first ever space acrylic painting that I did, and I did it 8 or 9 years ago. It was the first birthday present I ever made for Mark when we first started dating. And there are loads of things that I would do differently now to kind of get the blending, but as a first go, it's still on the wall. It looks like the Crab Nebula, which is a good start. But these paintings that I've been doing this last year have been using acrylic fluid art. If you haven't checked any of that stuff out on YouTube, it is so addictive to watch. It's really fun to do. And what I like about it is when you generally are doing an astronomy sketch, you tend to focus on everything looking precisely correct. With this art technique, you might have an idea of what you want it to look like. It just won't come out like that. You really have to just accept that you will get what you get at the end of it. And that's actually liberating. As somebody that's a bit of a control freak, it's quite kind of like, ooh, what's going to happen? But it's really good fun. And basically, the first couple of these that I did basically mix the paints with a pouring medium. I just use Floetrol. It's not technically a pouring medium, it's a paint conditioner, but it works. And you mix, it's about 2/3 Floetrol to 1/3 paint, and then you just add a bit of water until you've got a fluid consistency, and it's going to depend which technique you're doing. For this is just called a flip cup, so you pour all of the paints in a cup, put the canvas on it, flip the whole thing upside down, let it sit there for a couple of minutes, lift the thing off, the paint will go everywhere, and then you just tilt it around the canvas. pretty much anything at all like that that you do that has those traditional kind of galaxy colors, the minute you put stars on them, they look like space. It can be any color, any shape. If there's some black in the background and you use a toothbrush and some white paint and flick stars on it, make some bigger stars, you've basically got something that looks like some kind of abstract space art. Even if you don't want it to look like space art, it ends up looking like it anyway. This was another one I did, which kind of looks like one of those images that's been processed to capture the interstellar dust, and it's so cool, and you just really don't know what you're going to get out of this. It really is good fun. I'm not very good at doing the dots, so I now just have a series of cocktail sticks of different thicknesses, and I just dip those in the paint and dot them on afterwards. It's so much fun, and it really is a very liberating technique. If you add silicone into the paint, it then starts to create these really cool reactions whereby you start to get lacing and you get these little kind of cells pop up. Really good fun, and it really is just really, really cool fun to do. This was one that was inspired by Hubble palette, which isn't a palette I work with in my own imaging very often, but I wanted to do something that was totally away from my usual purple blue comfort zone, which I tend to reside in all the time with everything in my life. And there was actually a photograph on a calendar we had on the wall that month, and accidentally I almost recreated that nebula. But what's really fun about this, and this was a technique where the paint is a little bit more fluid, and I started off with black on the base first. All you do is get your different colors and pour them in a puddle on top of each other, not too much of it. Then you pour the paint around the outside. It has to be quite fluid for this. And then you get the hairdryer on it. You blow all the black paint over the top of the puddles first. Then you get the hairdryer in and just blow it out. And I've got a video at the end that will show this technique in action. I've filmed myself doing a couple. Immense fun. It really is immense fun. And then what you get out of it looks like it could be a supernova remnant, and once you put stars on it. The great thing about this is that if you find that you're not really that keen with the color palette you've chosen, again, just using that slider in Fast Stone Imagery, I stuck star spikes on it as well. I know they're a bit of a Marmite thing, but I think it made it look more like an authentic nebula picture. But basically, just by moving that one slider in Fast Stone to change the hue of the color palette, you get a totally different effect. So you could essentially get prints of this done in every different color, and it would look like totally different objects. So immense fun to do. This particular one was a different technique again. This was one where you have either a big cookie cutter or a cup with the bottom cut off it, and stick that into a puddle of paint, and then you start pouring all the paints inside that. And that means that all the acrylic paint has to then go down and underneath into the puddle, which means you get all this mixing. And particularly if you then add silicone as well, you'll get all of this kind of cell action going on. When I did this technique, I was wanting something that was going to come out and look a bit like an actual spiral galaxy. What I ended up with was something that looks like a storm system on Jupiter, but not in this color palette. I love it in this color palette, but when I just played with it and changed it into a brownish color and then monochrome, straight away it suddenly looks like it's a Juno photograph. It's just incredible the number of effects that you can get. And very often this is definitely not what I was going for when I made this painting, but what came out of it is one of my favorite acrylic art paintings to date. I just love this one so much. I love it in its original color. I love all three versions of it. It's just so pretty. I like playing around with techniques that people wouldn't think of for doing space art. And one of the mediums that I'm quite new to in terms of just real art is brusho. It's super concentrated, very finely milled paint pigment. And the way you do it is you can barely see the stuff, it's so fine. You use a dry paintbrush and flick it around the page, and then you just spray it with water, and you have no clue what you're going to get out of it, but what you end up with is what looks a bit like impressionistic kind of flower drawings, and then you can add little bits on to make it like a vase or whatever. And I had been playing around doing this kind of smudgy version of a butterfly, and I thought, I wonder what that'll look like if I invert it. And when I did that, this suddenly looked like a nebula except for the butterfly part. So I decided to set about having a go at doing some nebula pictures. I don't have very many colors of brusho pigment. That's fine. as you've just seen, you can completely change your color palette afterwards in processing anyway. So a very dry, fluffy paintbrush, it has to be bone dry. Flick it around the page. Less is definitely more. If you put too much on, it will just end up a muddy mess. And then when you invert it, it'll just have a big gray blob in the middle. So definitely err on the side of caution when it comes to how much you put on there. Then you just get a water sprayer with a really fine mist and just mist around it. And in true Blue Peter style, I'll move this aside and get one that I prepared earlier that was now dry. Once it's dry, you then use a black cocktail stick dipped in black paint to put stars on, and a paintbrush also with it, just acrylic paint with water, toothbrush, flick it around, make sure it's not uniform because a star field's never uniform. And then at the end of it, once that's dried, you can scan it, because this is A4, so you can just put it on the scanner and you end up with something that looks like this, and then you invert it and you end up with that. And it's a bit kind of, it's not as smooth because of the way the technique works, and particularly because you've got to do it on watercolor paper or else it'll warp and wrinkle. So it's got quite a lot of texture on it, but I quite like that. But again, once you start playing around with star spikes and changing the color palette, you end up with totally different effects. So it's just anything at all that you have that might be able to be inverted into a black spacescape, just have a go, because you never know what you might find that's a real hidden gem of a technique. Now, in terms of textiles, as I've just shown you, pretty much anything at all that you throw onto something with a black background will look like space if you put stars on it. And that's the case here. I did a kind of series of hand-painted tote bags. I do have black bags for kind of doing nebula stuff. I put a bit too much on there. It's better to see a bit of the black sky through it. But I wanted to do this kind of punch hole effect because the bag that I had for doing this was cream. But just using fabric or acrylic paint, they will both be completely watertight once they dry. Let that dry and then put stars on afterwards, and they just look really pretty. I also have kind of played around just with a vague shape of a galaxy on these punch holes as well. They're just really pretty, just space inspired. It doesn't matter that they're not accurate to anything in particular. If I have anything that is paintable, I have had a go at doing various things, and this included a pair of shoes. This replaced a very expensive pair of Converse that I bought about 8 years ago that I wore until they fell apart. And I thought, I bought them for £40 the first time. When I went to buy some more, they were 120. And I thought, you know what? I can get some shoes from Primark and paint them myself. And that's what I did. So works really well. Same thing with a pair of jeans. There were an old pair of Primark jeans that I've just blobbed one color of purple paint on, then added stars, and they look like nebula jeans. And I've seen similar jeans like this for sale for 50 quid online. So you can do it yourself. And as long as you don't put too much paint on, otherwise it gets a bit stiff. I've done all kinds of stuff on t-shirts as well. This was a technique using Sharpie of all different colors that you scribble in random patterns and then use nail varnish remover or rubbing alcohol and just basically create a massive chromatography experiment. This looked great for one wear, then it got washed and then everything washed out because the permanent markers I use were the cheap ones from the works. So if you're going to try this, please buy Sharpies or something that is actually permanent. Otherwise, you're going to get one wear out of it. But it just shows that anything at all really that has a black background with any colors on with stars will work. I've done tissue boxes like this, and just it can be completely artistic. You can just chuck a random planet in the middle of a nebula. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that it's not accurate scientifically. I have a mobility scooter that has interchangeable panels, and the blue ones were never my favorite, even though I usually like blue. So I decided to spray them black, and then using blue spray paint, with spray paint, the harder you spray, the more paint comes out. And if you do it a little bit, you get spatters that look like stars already. So this took me probably 90 seconds from start to finish. It was so quick to do. And then I just added a few more stars on afterwards. And then I now have a space themed mobility scooter. The temptation to spray the entire mobility scooter like this now is really strong. I've resisted so far, but the panels aren't big enough now. I love the design on them, but it just shows anything at all can be made to look nebula or galaxy if you do those sorts of things. very briefly show you a couple of other things that are kind of astronomy inspired. I guess this sort of imagery is more associated with astrology, but I've always loved the celestial artwork that goes back through history. I've a house full of it from the 1990s. I've never stopped having it on the walls. This was me experimenting with pyrography. So the pyrography tool is basically a soldering iron, but with interchangeable pointed tips, and then you just burn the wood. Amazing fun, and the smell of burning wood is lovely, so really good fun. I tend to mark these out first of all with carbon paper, just very gently, so I know where I'm going. Very therapeutic. Keep the cats away from it though, because they might burn themselves. And I've also done a bit of needlepoint. This was a kit, so I didn't design this myself, but you know, this sort of artwork just really speaks to me. So I really enjoyed doing the needlepoint stuff. I had a quick go at mosaics. As much as I liked it, I didn't like the act of having to keep cutting and sanding down all the mosaic pieces. I spent 6 months with open wounds on my knuckles where I was filing them down. So while I'm glad I did this, I don't think I'll ever do it again. But if I was going to do one, it was going to have to be astronomy themed. The other thing that I make is I am a bass guitar player, and my bandmates who play guitar always give me their old strings, and I like to upcycle them into guitar string jewelry. And doing these multi-layered bangles really makes me think of orbit diagrams, although the orbits are obviously not to scale. I just think anything that's got multiple kind of lines around just makes me think of orbits, whether it be a planetary or a stars, whatever. And the minute you put those things on, these just, whoever buys these may not even think they look like an astronomy orbit, but to me they do, and I think they look really good fun. And you can experiment with lots of different objects. You can make things look a bit like planets by using different colors and sizes, or you can just keep it totally abstract, and just the fact that you've got the multiple layers for me makes it look like, this one in particular, I think 4 layers looks epic with the stars and the planets on. So I really like doing these, and I then wire wrap them and just solder the ends just to try and hold them in place. So I pass the strings once, because guitar strings have a mind of their own. They won't stay where you put them very easily. So I kind of use a really wide bore bead and make sure I've crossed everything over within it, right up to the point that the hole is then kind of, the strings don't move very easily through it. And if that means bracing it with small pieces of string, I will do that. But wire wrap it, solder it, they will stay put, and they look really cool. I don't really make these necklaces anymore like this, because I just fear that if anyone got that caught, a guitar string is not going to snap. So from a safety perspective, I don't do a very good job of gluing the end caps on so that they will break if this got caught. But the idea of somebody getting hurt means I don't make those anymore. So I just focus on the bangles. They look really cool. Another thing I do is hand paint pendants to look like dragon eyes. And this technique is, again, really good fun. And all the work, this is done with nail varnishes on the back of glass cabochons, and all the work is done by scraping off or blending with a scalpel blade or an awl or a map pin or something. So there's lots of different layers, and you scrape bits off and put another layer, scrape it off, and then you start blending stuff. And some of these will have 15 layers on them, so they take a long time. But I was just struck when I did the Eye of Sauron ones how much like a sunspot they looked. So obviously this is sort of what a sunspot looks like. So I did these, and the technique did work in principle, but in future I'm definitely going to make them more asymmetrical, because all I think of when I look at this is a cat's bum. So I don't think I would ever wear it, because I think I need to make the sunspots a bit less uniform. But the technique definitely works. And what the photograph doesn't capture here is, if you use shimmering nail varnishes, when these move and catch the light, they look so stunning, and there's so much depth to them that you just don't get by sticking a picture on the back of a glass cabochon. I also try and paint nebula inspired stuff on the back of the glass cabochons using nail varnishes, but also a side product of the acrylic pouring is that you end up with acrylic paint on the top of the, I always have parchment paper or a silicone mat down, and then the acrylic paint will fully dry. You can peel it off and do things with them. And a lot of my acrylic skins end up looking spacey. So you end up with something that's kind of space inspired. Now I'm going to finish off with another video to show you how I created something that was inspired by one of my all-time favorite pieces of artwork. We had this set of encyclopedias when I was a child. Door-to-door salesmen used to come to your house and sell you an entire set of encyclopedias. This was the one I just gravitated towards over and over again. And in it was a David A. Hardy painting of what was supposed to be what Pluto might be like. And I always loved this ice cave painting, and just by chance I was watching one of my favorite fluid artists do a technique that made me instantly think of ice cave. Now it turns out being more of a rugged kind of thing, so it's not a copy of David's work, it's just inspired by that kind of looking out of a cave thing. So this is a technique that needs the paint to be very, very fluid, and in this video the paint wasn't really quite fluid enough, but I did just make it work. So the great thing about this is you put your layer down, cover the canvas, and then you just pour paint around the outside of the canvas. It's just in squirty bottles, just literally chuck it all down on top of each other and just layer it up. It doesn't really matter what way you do it, just chuck it on and see what happens. And then you're going to get the hairdryer on it and just blow the paint around high speed. This could have been a bit more fluid to move around more, but what you get where the paint mixes up because of the Floetrol and because of the water that's in there, you can end up with what looks like loads and loads of rugged rocks that you've spent absolutely ages agonizing over. You can then go in and fine tune it blowing with your mouth or with a straw, which I've cut that out because I was at it for ages. The great thing is if you don't like a bit, you just pour some more paint over it, some black paint over it, blow it off, and then you can do that bit again. It's really, really forgiving. That was what the dried result was like, and I kind of added some little bits here with a straw, just blowing the paint around, and this really does look like a rocky ice cave. And then with a brush I went in and just painted some sea and some stars and stuff like that. This technique has so much potential, and I had a quick go at doing it for a kind of lava world. First of all, I used way too much paint, so I had to kind of do a lot of correcting afterwards, but I used a palette that involved too much metallic. It didn't really work in terms of, I was thinking about a very old Mars when there was still kind of red lava around. That was what was in the back of my mind. Didn't quite work, but this technique definitely has potential, and I need to not use gold because the gold didn't really work. But so I spent ages just going in, pouring more paint around and just kind of tipping it around afterwards until I got something I was happy with. The result when I'd finished was this, which, because of the gold in it, doesn't really look like lava. So I've got a plan of something to do in the background first, and then I'm going to repeat this technique but with some yellows and oranges rather than gold. And basically this is screaming for me to draw a Balrog on it because we're massive Lord of the Rings fans, and this looks like a Balrog cave to me. So that is basically all I'm going to talk about tonight. Now that I have a separate webcam, I do have the availability of being booked to actually do hands-on actual drawing workshops with people. I do these in pencil because that's what people are going to have at home. So if that's of interest for you guys for the future, if any of you are in societies that might want to do this, this is now an option. And I've figured out a way of getting the camera angles on my hands and then screen sharing the photographs so you can see me drawing and the screen, and we do it together. And so far it's worked out really well. So thank you very much. I'm sorry if I've talked for too long, but I wanted to cram in as many of the tutorial steps as I could so that you could all have a go at this stuff yourself when we're finished.
That's it. Fantastic. Thank you, Mary. Thank you ever so much indeed. That was really, really fascinating. Some of the sketches
you've blown my mind. You've absolutely blown my mind. There's so many things I want to try with my kids now. Thank you.
Kids love doing this stuff.
Well, I think we need to get you booked for next time we're having a star party at Luxor, and I think doing some of the sort of hands-on stuff. That's a good shout. Really fun. I think
absolutely. Absolutely.
Kids and adults.
I have to say, a lot of the kids' sketches were probably about 10 steps ahead of what I'm going to be able to produce. But I bought some pencils. I couldn't tell you what ones they were now, but I bought some pencils and what's the other thing? A blending stick years ago, and they've sat carefully and safely in the cupboard ever since the day I got them. So perhaps I've heard this before actually of people, you know, obviously taking the photo, producing the photo, and then sketching from that in order to see more details.
Because
really...
I've got spinal problems, I really struggle to sit hunched over an eyepiece for as long as it would take me to do a detailed sketch. So for me, the sketching from a photograph's a no-brainer because I can walk away and have a stretch and a break and come back to it, where you can't do that at the eyepiece. But the plus side of the eyepiece is there isn't as much to draw because you literally can't see that much detail unless you've got a 1 meter telescope. So, you know, this is why we do image stacking, because it brings out more detail. You literally can't see that level of detail. So I haven't done the moon at the eyepiece yet. I've done the sun and I've done deep sky, but I haven't been brave enough to try the moon yet.
That should be fun, and like you say, Grant, it's a great one to do with the children.
Somebody's just said in the chat that polyfiller can be used to make models. Yeah, that's a really good idea.
Oh, instead of the latex,
Yeah.
instead of the latex stuff. Is that easy to get a hold of? That I mean,
liquid latex. Yeah, you just get
yeah.
it from Amazon. Craft shops always have it. It smells revolting, so you need a well ventilated area. It smells of fish, but if you get a more expensive one, it doesn't have as much odor. But I tend to use it for SFX makeup more than anything. So I'm usually sticking it on my face and turning myself into a zombie. So it's really good to do something astronomy with it as well.
Okay. I suppose not knowing about these things, but I guess the downside of polyfiller is it's going to be brittle as well. If you drop that, it's going to break. Whereas the latex is, as you say, just bounces and away you go.
It kind of the material you choose really is going to be determined by what you're going to do with it afterwards. And for outreach purposes, you don't want anything heavy that's going to break. And also with the pastel sketches, what I tend to do, because I've never yet found a fixative that doesn't leave marks on my page and spoil it, I never fix them. The first thing I do is scan them or photograph them, then they go into a wallet, and then they go in my originals folder and they never come out again. And I then get prints done of the photographs so that I've got a booklet that comes with me whenever I do talks that's got prints of my sketch photographs so that people can flick through it without any damage being done, or if the thing gets stolen for any reason, it's not gonna, or lost, my originals aren't lost then. So I just put them in a punched pocket and just never ever take them out of it again, because they do dull very, very easily.
Norman has a question. Not entirely sure what this is related to, Norman, so come on then. What's
Very, really, you know, thought-provoking talk. Have you tried the edible side? You know, obviously you're using a lot of paint. Have you tried chocolate?
I'm gonna now. I hadn't thought of it, but I guess you'd have to make sure you temper it properly, or it doesn't have the right texture. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on. I'm an expert at eating it, but not tempering it.
Might work better for lunar, I suspect.
No, it's a good idea. And I know people 3D print this stuff as well, and that's really good. But I think if you put something into a 3D printer and then go and pick it up, you haven't studied the topography of the crater and that kind of thing. So as much as I love 3D printing, I think that making it yourself will make you learn way more. And I'm all up for the trying stuff with chocolate for sure.
Oh, you just give me an idea there. 3D printing, or print 3D with chocolate.
Oh, now that I'd buy one of.
Yeah.
I actually have a 3D printed model of Tycho, so I could make an imprint of that on something and then use it as a mold for chocolate, so I can make some chocolate Tychos.
I was going to say you can download 3 printable models from NASA for various craters and stuff, which would be good fun.
They're very good for people that have visual impairment, because they've got something they can feel and touch, and That's important because it's very difficult to describe a crater, isn't it? And that you can also get them for galaxies as well. They're kind of like relief prints of galaxies of different shapes, and people that have visual impairment can just feel the actual shapes of the stars and the spiral arms, and I think that's fantastic. So 3D printing definitely has a role to play in this stuff.
Indeed. Steve Ibbenson, your good lady wife appears to have had some experience with the brusho techniques doing stuff.
Yes, she has. She does card making and such like, and she makes her own backgrounds for cards.
Excellent.
When she gets that sort of stuff, every flat surface is covered in bits of card. And you walk past and she's shouting at you, "Don't touch that, mind that." And I think, I'll go and live in the shed. Because
they're so wet, because you've sprayed water on them. If you move them even a bit, you'll get drips. And so, yeah, it's... And
then she'll say, "Oh, it's rubbish."
We all say that about our own artwork. Most of us say it about our own imaging as well. So
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, true.
20, oh, I don't know. Then months later, she'll pull it out. "Oh, I'll use that as a background. It doesn't look bad. Where did I get that from?" You did it yourself.
So I've had this happen when I used to have art classes in the 90s. I just doing some interesting still lifes, and we'd go to her house every Saturday. And I went back the second week of this still life class. I was like, "Where's mine?" She said, "That's yours. That's not mine. I didn't paint that. That looks like the display." "No, that's definitely yours." And I'm like, I can't have done that. And just that week's gap in between, I didn't even recognize my own work. It's really, your brain is very harsh on yourself sometimes, and it's
very much so.
Does anyone on the call tonight, does anyone do any sketching or art at the moment? I think Kate's holding something up.
Happy cat.
We can't.
Can't see it because of the virtual background.
Yeah, your virtual background's killing it, Kate. But...
Okay, I'll find.
Can you post it in the chat?
If you can turn off your background, it would.
I used to do sketching years ago, and in one of the house moves, I lost all my sketches.
Oh no!
Yeah. I also find it.
I do.
Sorry.
That's one of the things I do. I'm an artist. I sell paintings.
I do,
Dave. Well done.
Yeah.
A guitarist, artist,
astrophotographer. Well, I just had a go with what Mary was saying about scraping the pastel. I sometimes use pastels and mix them in with other media, watercolor in particular, and it does work, Mary.
Yeah, I'm really keen to try it because it gives a lovely soft effect, doesn't it? Oh wow!
That was I just looked at the Pleiades on Stellarium and just scraped it and
gorgeous. By the way, it was Mark Radis was the sketcher that did the talk at Basingstoke Astronomy that gave me that tip. I've remembered his name.
Yeah, it does. It kind of works.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I hadn't thought of it myself.
As you know, in pastels, there's white and white.
Yes.
And the pastel pencil white tends to be a bit bland, I think. But if you've got a stick, I'm pretty sure that'll really do the job.
Yeah, I've got one of those sets, you know, the monochrome set of the pastel pencil stick. So it goes from black to white, and it's got about 15 shades of grey in between. The downside of those is I find that once you've put that grey on there, you can't then highlight white on top of it. It's got a different formula that won't let you build a lighter colour on top. And one of the things I love when I do art is doing the light colours last. It's why I've always liked acrylics and oil paints, and I've never got on with watercolour because I like to slap everything on and then highlight afterwards. And you just can't do that with pencil sketching and watercolors. My watercolor paintings are shockingly bad.
I think Kate's got a camera sorted. Yeah.
Oh wow.
Oh, very nice.
What medium's that, Kate?
You're muted, Kate.
If you hold the space
Yeah,
bar,
no,
you
it's
should
right.
be
I
able to-
thought my button on my headphones would. I'd sketched that with a mobile phone, which has only got a 4.5-inch screen with a pen that pops out the bottom.
Oh my goodness.
I quite like stuff like those.
Amazing.
I did Einstein in pastels. When I was at
Oh wow, Dave.
when I
That's
was in
phenomenal.
I just get a bit bored when you're at an exhibition and watching people go by going, oh, these are nice, and not coming out with any dosh. So you just pastels are quite a nice way of of passing the time, for want of a better word. So I remember I did just because you can carry them anywhere. I did talking as well.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
I've never attempted portrait.
that's the first ones I do. I don't usually do it, but
So how did you approach it in terms of step by step? Is it a similar way to doing other paintings then, with the mapping it out and light and dark?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You paint what you see. That's the classic thing, isn't it? And some of the things are the comments I like are things like you've got to be bright, you've got to be brave enough to fail. That's what I teach my students in my art groups that I run. And the other one is experimentation is the start of invention. I think as long as you've got those things in your head and paint what you see, you can't go wrong.
I did do a drawing that was a copy of a kind of it was like a perfume advert or something when I was doing art at school, and I didn't have a clue how to start it, and I actually sat down and spent ages on it, and that ended up looking like a photograph. I was absolutely gobsmacked, but I've never tried it again since, and it was I was really surprised at how well it turned out, and it was on display for my art GCSE, and somebody drew on it with paint, and so it's ruined, which is really annoying.
Oh no. So I just wanted to go back to Kate. Kate, those pictures that you were showing there. So you sketched those on your phone and then painted them afterwards.
Hang on.
There we go. That's it.
My phone has it's just a little Samsung that has a pen in the bottom.
Yeah.
And I sketched it on the screen, and then it's just a PNG. I email myself.
Brilliant.
You pick the medium you want to use in, whether it's pastel, ink, watercolor, oils, whatever. It's Autodesk Sketchbook Mobile. It's free. It's a really good app. And I just like to use the black nib pen and block filler afterwards. Sort of effectively, it's paint builder. So it's like just drawing with an ink pen and then watercolor afterwards, which is how I would naturally sketch if I was going to sketch. That's my preferred approach. I like to do it as I'm looking at the object in the moment. I'm listening to you and you're doing it from your photos and things. It was making me think, how could I do this at the eyepiece and not get cold?
Yeah. Well, Jonathan Harty from North Wales Astro, he uses that app on his iPad, and he's been doing loads of eyepiece sketches with it, and they just look like actual sketches. I mean, I've got a Nintendo DS from 15 years ago, and that's got an art game on it that lets you draw, but it's very, very crude, and you can get some good stuff with it, but the technology must have come on so much since then, and his iPad sketches are phenomenal. They really are.
The biggest difficulty is trying to hold your phone in one hand and sketch, and not put as soon as you put your other hand, which is holding the pen, onto the phone, you leave a mark. So it's quite fiddly. So
would it not wreck your night vision staring at the screen though, or can you turn the brightness right down?
I guess you'd have to work it in invert, i.e. do a black screen. Your sketch is black and you're sketching with a white pen, which you could do. And
Or
that would address the...
eat loads of Quality Street and cover it.
No, you were talking about Quality Street. I saw Grant laugh because when I did my 3D vision image, I actually went in my box a bit. You probably recognise what that is, and also that one, which is one of my favourite chocolates.
Yeah, I did. I'm such a hoarder because I do a lot of other craft activities as well. And there's always something useful you can do with these things. And at Christmas, everyone seems to buy you a tin of Quality Street and you end up with sacks of empty wrappers. It's like I'm going to end up on one of those TV shows where they come to my house and find carrier bags full of Quality Street wrappers. So I just have to say, no, I know I can use it, but some of it just can't be kept anymore.
I can relate to that. I have an envelope full of Quality Street wrappers, but they come out, they make Christmas cards.
They're really good, really useful, and buying coloured polythene is quite expensive. So,
and not as fun.
Very interesting talk.
Indeed, not as fun. Yeah, yes, it was. Yes, absolutely. Okay. Well, in that case, unless anybody's got any other burning questions, Kate, thank you. Kate, Mary, thanks very much indeed. We've kept you for even longer now.
No, it's no problem. I don't have to drive home. It's not a problem.
Well, I was going to say, Mary, we would definitely like to have you back for your Women in Astronomy talk at some point in the future. Excellent. I think that'd be very interesting. And if and when we can get back to some star parties, I think if it was possible to get you down to one of our star parties in Luxor, I think it'd go down really well with the kids, and I'm sure plenty of adults would love a go as well. And it'd be super.
Absolutely.
Well, if anyone has to go at sketching, please tag me on social media. My details were on the card. If this has been recorded, just go back and look at my business card. Just email me or just send me it. I'd love to see it. It's great when people have a go after seeing my talk. So I'd love that.
Indeed, I suspect we're going to see Amazon's now going to sell out of black paper and rubber latex, and Jeff's going to think, what's going on here? What's happened?
Well, I'm actually really pleased that I made myself start learning pencil sketching in more detail, because it's actually really nice. Now I've got my head around it. You've just got to do it slightly back to front than the pastels, but I always gravitate to pastels. It's just my favorite.
They looked amazing. They really did. And again, if anybody's not had a chance to visit Mary's website, please do for some more of her images and links to her shop as well, where you can indeed go and purchase some old guitar strings. Apparently that's
oh, buy some prints of my sketches.
Yeah, well, indeed, yes, indeed. Mary, many thanks again.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Grant, have we got a speaker for next week?
We have them prepared. We've got Colin Stewart coming back to give us his talk, How We'll Live on Mars. And, hopefully some of you saw Colin last time, but Colin is a superb science communicator and speaker. So it'll be a really, really interesting and informative and entertaining talk knowing Colin. So hope to see some of you again next week.
Indeed, and we look forward to that one. In the meantime, stay safe, everyone. Have a great week, and we will see you next Sunday.
Bye.
Take care. Thanks again, Mary.
Bye.
Good night.